China has been famously active in this effort, employing 40,000 cyber police to monitor subversive pages on the internet and banning several. When a Chinese language American site called for a jasmine revolution in China, Beijing prevented all searches for the word jasmine, even if you were merely looking for jasmine tea or the Disney princess. It's too early to say whether the internet will continue to elude the attempts of governments to curb its freedom, but Orwell teaches us that they will try. Indeed, even before the internet, when you talk about the Arab Spring, SMSs had a tremendous role in organizing the get-togethers on Tahrir Square. It wasn't just Facebook and Twitter, which have been given a lot of the credit. So there is a tremendous involvement of the early 20th, 21st century technology in challenging government control. However, the Orwellian dangers to the use of language in public life that I'm worried about as a politician are somewhat different from the dangers I worried about in my previous avatar of the United Nations. There, diplo-speak too is a fertile form of newspeak, in which words do not mean what they ostensibly mean. Only diplomacy, for example, could invent the concept of the non-paper, which is of course a paper, or to speak of frank and friendly discussions and referring to near violent disagreement. But then in diplomacy, words are intended to conceal as much as they reveal. Reading between the lines of a diplomatic declaration is a required skill, and understanding that what is not said is sometimes more significant than what is said is essential to the practice of diplomacy. Very different from the ethos of the writer, the literature, you might think. In fact, in 1989, someone who claimed to be a regular reader of my columns in those days offered me a challenge to reconcile in one of my columns my interests in international affairs and in literature. I told him it couldn't be done except in jest, imagining which works of literature would be most appropriate for the then prevalent international situation. The winter of our discontent for Romania that year, for example, though the grapes of wrath might have done just as well. 100 years of solitude for Albania's isolationist Politburo. Joy in the morning for the release of Nelson Mandela, and so on. He seemed to accept the answer that my conscience wasn't so obliging. Regular readers inconveniently insisted must be obliged. Then the elevation of Havel, Václav Havel, to the presidency of Czechoslovakia that year gave me a better answer. For here was the perfect marriage of the worlds of literature and international affairs. A playwright, and that to a dissident playwright, ascending to political power. He'd spent many years imprisoned and silenced by his own government because they feared his words. He'd become a symbol and a spokesman of the democratic forces of his country, and words, he once declared, have the power to change history. By his own triumphal ascent to power, he demonstrated that the writer of words can also change history, can make as well as reflect it. In Peru, Mario Vargas Llosa, the novelist, ran for president because he felt that as a writer, and I'm quoting him here, he had a unique understanding of the people, their needs, their concerns, their spirit. And at a desperate time for his country, he entered the fray. The voters didn't, in the end, make him president, but his profession was not discredited. And indeed, a few months later, a notch lower in the pecking order, Nicaraguan novelist Sergio Ramirez won re-election the same month, not the next one, the same month, as his country's vice president. So you have seen now the wielders of words trying to exercise political power in the name of their sensibility. Now, that's in democratic politics. But our diplomats are uniquely suited, provided they have the gifts to begin with, to be creative writers. My friend, the former United Nations colleague, Jayanta Dhanapala from Sri Lanka, argues that the professional diplomat, like the sensitive writer, is uniquely qualified because he has to mix with both the elites and the masses, be firmly rooted in his own culture while open to the experience of others, have inner resources to fall back upon in coping with the isolation of a foreign posting, what Auden called this nightmare of public solitude. And most tellingly, Dhanapala argues, diplomats see creative writing as an escape valve for their professional compromises and frustrations, an act of expiation for the bruising of the soul they've experienced in their working life. For many, the only alternative is alcohol. So I don't know whether my our dear moderator today, Ed, is going to share this view, but certainly the use of language in many ways can serve as a source of escape, of resistance, and of subversion. Now, as a writer and a reader, I am conscious of how much reading and learning does to broaden minds, and I'm convinced that ignorance and prejudice remain handmaidens of violence and fear. This is as true of terrorism, that arch engine of destruction in the world today and of disruption, as it is in modern civil conflicts, that the men of war prey on the ignorance of the populace to instill fears and arouse hatreds. Murderous conflicts in recent years has perhaps been a greater threat than the totalitarianism that Orwell feared in Bosnia and Rwanda in my own years at the United Nations, where murderous, even genocidal ideologies took root in the absence of truthful information and honest education. If only half the effort had gone into teaching those peoples what united them and not what divided them, unspeakable crimes could have been prevented. And I would argue that looking to what unites us is no threat to our sense of what makes us special, our distinctive individual identities. Yet, many do feel threatened. The biggest challenge to coexistence within many societies and between societies comes from the assault that the forces of both global convergence and disruption make on our identity. Orwell saw totalitarianism as fundamentally a threat to individual identity. But in many ways today, the fundamental clash, the fundamental conflict of our times is a clash between not civilization so much as doctrines. Religious and ethnic fundamentalism on the one hand, secular consumerist capitalism on the other. The author Benjamin Barber has written of the twin prospects facing humanity as jihad versus McWorld. It's the title of his book. Jihad in the name of 100, I'm quoting here, narrowly conceived faiths against every kind of interdependence, against technology, against pop culture, against integrated markets, against modernity itself, versus a McWorld of globalization run rampant, a world of fast music, fast computers, and fast food, with MTV, Macintosh, and McDonald's pressing nations into one commercially homogeneous theme park, unquote. Now, both jihad and McWorld, of course, end up by doing what the totalitarians in Orwell's dystopias did, by obliterating our most precious possession, our identity. Now, every one of us has multiple identities. I am, for example, an Indian, a male, a Hindu by religion, a Nair by caste, a Keralite by geography of descent, a Malayali by language, a writer, a vegetarian, a government minister, an elected politician, a cricket fanatic, a theatre buff, a former UN official, and so on. All identities that I might claim as a principal identity at a specific moment at different times. Amartya Sen has famously argued that ascribing singular identities to people, for example, calling someone a Muslim while overlooking these other aspects of his individual makeup, leads to the miniaturization of human beings and the belittling of human identity. He's argued passionately against reducing individuals to a choiceless singularity. Few people, after all, have a choice about the religion they're born into. And all of us have so much more complexity to our identities. Sometimes religion obliges us to deny the truth about our own complexity by obliterating the multiplicity inherent in our identities. Religious fundamentalism in particular does so because it embodies a passion for pure belonging, a yearning intensified by the threatening tidal wave of globalization, as well as by the nature of politics in many West Asian countries. And yet we need to understand why so many today, in privileging one amongst the many identities they could lay claim to, have fallen back on religion. Why are so many political grievances, real or imagined, articulated in religious terms? The answer surely lies in the primordial nature of religious identity. When other avenues of identity mobilization are either restricted in autocratic states or difficult in societies where political patterns are entrenched and admit few interlopers, then ordinary people tend to fall back on the one identity that seems basic to them. Secular intellectuals like Sen, or for that matter myself, may give equal weight to the tag of being a cricket fan, or in his case an Oxbridge Don, to the fact of being born in a Hindu family. But we are a minority in today's world, and it would be unwise indeed for us to ignore the clarion call of religious fanaticism to so many desperate young men and even a few women around the world. Of course, there can be something precious and valuable about religious identity, but having a faith that allows a human being to see himself at one with others, stretching their hands out towards God around the world. Can we separate religion from political identity? Can we dream of a world in which religion has an honored place, but where the need for spirituality will no longer be associated with the need to belong to a set of political beliefs? If identity can relate principally to citizenship rather than faith, to a land rather than a doctrine, and if that identity is one that can live in harmony with other identities, then we might resist both jihad and the world. If we all come to understand and accept that every one of us has many identities, then perhaps we can assert each of them without attacking others. And as a writer, I'm attracted to what one might call the cultural construct of identity, of which religion is only a part, and to many not even the most important one. Now, we must admit that many have seen globalization as a threat to the differentiated cultures of the non-Western parts of the world. The great post-Orwellian fear is that indigenous cultures will be swept aside in a great tidal wave of MTV, McDonald's, and Mickey Mouse. It would indeed be a new twist to the Orwellian dystopia if everyone was wearing jeans, drinking Coca-Cola, using Intel, going to Starbucks, flying Boeing, and watching Hollywood. As an Indian author, coming from a country that has globalized more rapidly than most in recent years, and whose culture has therefore been subject to Western influences of a highly visible kind, I'm particularly conscious of this. And yet I'd argue that India is a good example of the counter-argument, that we've shown that the global reach of Western consumer products has proven in India that we can drink Coca-Cola without becoming Coca-colonized. Despite the fears of many, Baywatch and burgers have not supplanted Bharatanatyam dances and Bhelpuri snacks. Our own popular culture has become part of globalization. The products of Bollywood are exported not just to expatriate Indian communities abroad, but also to foreigners, notably Arabs and Africans. A Senegalese friend told me of his illiterate mother in a village who takes a bus to the capital city of Dakar once a month just to watch a Bollywood movie. She can't understand the Hindi. She's illiterate, so she can't read the French subtitles either. But these movies are made to be understood despite such handicaps. And she watches the song and dance and the music, and she has a great time. An Indian diplomat friend a few years ago in Syria told me that the only portraits in Damascus that were as big as those of the then President Hafiz al-Assad were those of the Indian Bollywood superstar Amitabh Bachchan. So why should we fear Orwellian dominance by westernized global ethos in such circumstances? Indian music, Indian fashion, Indian movie stars are also demonstrating new forms of convergence in the West today. With that convergence comes an interesting form of disruption, because in England today, Indian curry houses, Indian restaurants, have proliferated to such an extent that they actually employ more people in Britain than the iron and steel, coal mining and shipbuilding industries combined. So the empire can strike back. Where does this leave the human imagination? Well, in my first novel, Great Indian Novel, I reinvented our 2,000-year-old epic, the Mahabharata, as a satirical retelling of the story of 20th century India from the British days to the present. And my motivation was a conscious one. Most developing countries are formerly colonized countries, and one of the realities of colonialism is that it appropriated the cultural definition of its subject peoples. Writing about India in English, I cannot but be aware of those who have done the same before me, others with a greater claim to the language, but a lesser claim to the land. But their stories are not my stories, their heroes are not mine, and my fiction seeks to reclaim my country's heritage for itself, to tell in an Indian voice a story of India. And let me stress a story of India, for there are always other stories and other Indians to tell them. How important is such a reassertion of identity in the face of the enormous challenges confronting a country like India? Can literature even matter in a land of poverty, suffering, and underdevelopment? I believe it does. I've argued, in fact, my novel begins with the proposition that India is not, as people kept calling it in those days, an underdeveloped country, but rather in the context of its history and cultural heritage, India is a highly developed country in an advanced state of decay. Such sentiments are the privilege of the satirist. But as a novelist, I believe with Moliere that you have to entertain in order to edify. But edify to what end? What's the responsibility? of the writer, the journalist, the creative artist in a developing country in our globalizing world. In my own writing, I pointed to one responsibility, to contribute towards and to help articulate and give expression to the cultural identity, shifting, variegated and multiple in the Indian case, of the post-colonial society caught up in the throes of globalization. We have to realize that both colonialism and globalization have in many ways fractured and distorted the cultural self-perceptions of many of these societies. So development can't occur without some reassertion of identity. This is who we are, this is what we are proud of, this is what we want to be. We have to find, as creative artists, new ways and revive old ones of expressing our evolving culture. Just as society strives in the midst of globalization to find new ways of being and becoming. Globalization, as advocates say, is about growth and development, but it can't just be a set of figures on GNP tables, a matter for economists rather than a matter of people. We're all familiar with the notion that man does not live by bread alone. After all, why does man need bread? To survive. Why survive if it's only to eat more bread? To live is to more than just sustain life. It is to enrich and be enriched by life. Our poorest men and women in the developing world feel the throb of imagination on their pulse, for they tell stories to their children under the starlit skies, stories of their land and its heroes, stories of the earth and its mysteries, stories that have gone into making them what they are. And since my second novel is about Bollywood, they see and hear stories too, in the flickering lights of the thousands of cinemas in our land, where myth and escapist fantasy intertwine, and moral righteousness almost invariably triumphs with the closing credits. And this is as it should be. For if people are to develop, it's unthinkable that they would develop without literature, without song and dance and music and myth, without stories about themselves, and in turn without expressing their views on their present lot and their future hopes. Development implies dynamism. Dynamism requires freedom, freedom to create. Creativity requires, quite simply, imagination. And in speaking of the cultural reassertion of imagination as an answer to Orwell's fears, I do not want to defend a closed construct. I believe Indians will not become any less Indian if, in Mahatma Gandhi's metaphor, we open the doors and windows of our country and let foreign winds blow through our house. Of course, the winds of globalization must blow both ways. And I believe that what we have learned from the world, from the good and the bad, from the disruption and the convergence, is that, as indeed the acolytes of Osama bin Laden and the young foot soldiers of the Taliban have taught us, the globe will always have more than a single mind. And this can be a virtue if all these minds can be inoculated against violence, against hatred, against intolerance. And that is why the human imagination is so essential in our shrinking globe. As someone once observed about water pollution, we all live downstream. We're all interconnected. But without extending our imagination, we cannot understand how peoples of other races, religions, or languages can share the same dreams, the same hopes. Without educating and broadening our minds, without reading more extensively, we cannot understand the myriad manifestations of the human condition, nor fully appreciate the universality of human aims and aspirations. This is a good argument for a festival of literature, because I would argue that the specificities of literature are the best antidote to the fear-dominated globalization of the imagination. It is the world shaped by literature that understands the world and responds to its needs. Literature teaches us to empathize, to look beyond the obvious and beneath the surface, to bear in mind the smaller picture of the ordinary human beings who are ultimately the objects of our public policy. And above all, to remember that there's always more than one side to a story, more than one answer to a question. To do all this, to respect our different cultural identities while learning to coexist with each other in peace and harmony, we must promote pluralism. My own faith in pluralism is a legacy of my upbringing in secular India. I remember in the neighborhood where I lived in Calcutta in my high school years, the wail of the muezzin calling the Islamic faithful to prayer would actually blend with the tinkling of bells and the chanting of mantras at the Shiva temple nearby, which in turn was competing with the loudspeakers outside the Sikh Gurudwara, reciting verses from the Granth Sahib, and just around the corner was St. Paul's Cathedral in Calcutta. That was the Indian experience that I had, and it explains why, in a country like India, we had after the 2004 general elections the extraordinary phenomenon of a political party winning the election, a party headed by a woman of Italian descent and Catholic faith background, who then made way for a Sikh to be sworn in as Prime Minister by a Muslim president in a country 81% Hindu. This is the and it is, in my view, the best answer to those who would want to totalize, who would want to produce uniformity. A little later, 4 years later, we had the election of Barack Obama, which was a wonderful affirmation of the same idea, but at the same time reminded us that for 220 years, the world's oldest democracy didn't manage to elect a president or a vice president who wasn't white, male, and Christian. And when Obama was elected, he still ticked 2 of those 3 boxes. So there's still a way for us to go, but I think the world is evolving. Now, I'm very anxious to leave some time for questions, so let me just pull my threads together. We're all like Egyptian mummies, we are strapped for time. So, in much of the world, there exist societies whose richness lies in their soul and not in their soil, whose past may offer more wealth than their present, whose imagination is more valuable than their technology. Recognizing that this might be the case, and affirming that tolerance and imagination are as central to humanity's sense of its own worth as the ability to eat and drink and sleep under a roof, is part of the challenge before the world today and part of the answer to the lurking menace of the totalitarian alternative. The only way to ensure this challenge is met is to preserve cultural and imaginative freedom in all societies in this globalizing world, to guarantee that individual voices find expression, that all ideas and forms of art are enabled to flourish and contend for their place in the sun. We've heard in the past that the world must be made safe for democracy. That goal is increasingly being realized. It's now our duty to ensure that the world remains safe for diversity. I want to tell you a story that will encroach on your Q&A time. It's an old Indian story, about 2,000 years old, about truth, a story from our Puranas. It seems that in ancient times, a brash young warrior sought the hand of a beautiful princess. The king, her father, thought the warrior was a bit too cocksure and callow. He told him that he could only marry the princess once he had found truth. So the young warrior set out on a quest for truth. He went to temples and to monasteries, to mountaintops where sages meditated, and to forests where ascetics scourged themselves, but nowhere could he find truth. Despairing one day and seeking refuge from a thunderstorm, he found himself in a dank, musty cave. There in the darkness was an old hag, with warts on her face and matted hair, her skin hanging in folds from her bony limbs, her teeth broken, her breath malodorous. But she greeted him. She seemed to know what he was looking for. They talked all night, and with each word she spoke, the warrior realized he had come to the end of his quest. She was truth. In the morning when the storm broke, the warrior prepared to return to claim his bride. Now that I have found truth, he said, what shall I tell them at the palace about you? The wizened old crone smiled. Tell them, she said, tell them that I'm young and beautiful. So truth is not always true, but that does not mean that truth does not exist. Perhaps Orwell would agree. In any case, this has been a wonderful opportunity to reassert a view that I know he would have sympathized with. I think our only effective answer to totalitarians and terrorists, to all the forces that would seek to control our thoughts, our minds, our cultures, our lives, is to defiantly assert our own humanity. To say that each one of us, whoever we are and wherever we are, has the right to live, to love, to hope, to dream, and to aspire to a world in which everyone has that right. A world in which the scourge of terrorism is fought, but so also are the scourges of poverty, of famine, of illiteracy, of ill health, of injustice, and of human insecurity. I think Orwell would certainly have agreed with that, and I thank you for giving me this opportunity to share with you, through the celebration of Orwell, my own lifelong love for liberty, language, and literature.